Are the bodies of 3 condemned men buried in unmarked graves in Regina's beautiful Wascana Park? According to research by historians Frank Korvemaker and Kenton de Jong, this section of the park, the site of the former Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum, is the final resting place of 3 men, 2 of whom were hanged for murder, while the third died of tuberculosis. The 3 men were Night Gun, Antonio Luciano, and John Morrison. According to the Lethbridge News of Wednesday, May the 6th, 1896, Night Gun, an indigenous man, died at the jail from pulmonary affection the previous Friday and was buried on the jail grounds on Saturday. He had been serving 2 years for theft and had completed half his sentence. Night Gun was from the Blood Reserve and had been tried and sentenced in Lethbridge by Judge Rouleau. Yet, the Regina Morning Leader, for February the 18th, 1910, says Night Gun was awaiting execution for murder. Confusing. If anyone knows if Night Gun was indeed awaiting execution for murder, please share your knowledge in the comments. In the days ahead, join me as I tell the stories of the 2 condemned men buried in Wascana Park. They are Antonio Luciano, an Italian musician hanged on May the 10th, 1894, for the murder of a fellow countryman, and John Morrison, hanged on January 17, 1901, for one of the worst mass murders in Canadian history. I will also be sharing the story of Sanford Hainer, a Yorkton man hanged at the old jail on February the 17th, 1910, for the murder of his former employer, and who was buried in the Potter's Field at the old Regina Cemetery. So, stay tuned, and please be sure to check out Frank and Kenton's research on the old jail and the unmarked graves, links in the description. The footage you see is of me walking in that section of Wascana Park near where the 3 men are buried. I hope you will consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers! Are the bodies of 3 men buried in unmarked graves in Regina's beautiful Wascana Park? According to research by historians Frank Korvemaker and Kenton de Jong, this section of the park, the site of the former Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum, is the final resting place of 3 men, 2 of whom were hanged for murder, while the third died of tuberculosis. Today I share the story of the first man to be hanged, Antonio Luciano. At 8:13 a.m., on the morning of Thursday, May the 10th, 1894, Antonio Luciano, an Italian musician, was hanged at the old Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum in Regina for the murder of a fellow countryman, scissors grinder Giovanni Pettarella, whose decomposing body was found near Grenfell, Saskatchewan on June the 22nd, 1893. In spite of decomposition, Pettarella's skull was found to have been crushed in. Luciano was buried in the grounds of the former jail, now Regina's Wascana Park. Pettarella had been seen in the company of two fellow countrymen, Luciano and Antonio Gigidio, itinerant musicians. Luciano played the clarinet, his partner the bagpipes, the pair being arrested in Winnipeg on June the 26th. The musicians had $300 in their possession, while a large sum of money Pettarella had been carrying was not found with his corpse. As well, Gigidio was arrested wearing a battered hat similar to one worn by Pettarella, while the Regina leader claimed that one of the accused had been wearing Pettarella's coat. Luciano and Gigidio both came from a small village 50 miles north of Naples and would send money home to their families. On February the 10th, 1894, a Grenfell jury found them guilty of murder on purely circumstantial evidence. When the sentence of death was pronounced upon him, Luciano fell to the floor, weeping. Both men continued to proclaim their innocence, but a few days prior to the execution, Luciano confessed and claimed that he alone murdered Pettarella. As a result, Gigidio's sentence was commuted to life in prison, and Luciano went to the gallows alone, but retracted his earlier admission of guilt. On the scaffold, Luciano said, "I die innocent, like Jesus Christ. He died for everybody. I die for my partner Gigidio. I made the confession so that both might not die. We are both innocent. I am a stranger in a strange country. No one believes me but Jesus. Goodbye. I no kill the man." Was Luciano innocent? The scaffold, which stood 12 feet high, was built for the execution and contained parts from the gallows which had hanged Louis Riel. Luciano was the 7th man hanged in Regina. As for Gigidio, he would be released from prison on April the 22nd, 1902, and presumably return to Italy. I know I would have. The primary source for today's video was the chapter, The Scissors Grinder, from Boiling Point and Cold Cases, Boiling Point and Cold Cases, by journalists Barb Pacholik and Jana G. Pruden. All other sources from the contemporary press are listed in the description. As well, I've also put links to Frank and Kenton's research on the jail and the buried men in the description. The footage you see is me walking in that section of Wascana Park near where Luciano is buried. I hope you will consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. are the bodies of 3 men buried in unmarked graves in Regina's beautiful Wascana Park. According to research by historians Frank Korvemaker and Kenton de Jong, this section of the park, the site of the former Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum, is the final resting place of 3 men, 2 of whom were hanged for murder, while the third died of tuberculosis. Today, I share the story of the second man to be hanged and buried in Wascana Park, John Morrison. At 8 o'clock on Thursday, January the 17th, 1901, John Morrison, aged 27, was hanged at the Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum in Regina for the axe murders of 5 members of the MacArthur family at Welwyn, Saskatchewan on June the 9th, 1900. He took 13 minutes to die. Morrison was a home child who had been sent to Canada from his native Scotland to work for farm families, but he hadn't prospered, and at the time of the murders, he had been working for Alexander MacArthur for 8 years. Morrison's motive for the slaughter is unclear, but it appears to have been an elaborate suicide attempt involving sexual assault. Taking an axe, Morrison, who a newspaper described as a, quote, good and faithful servant, murdered Alexander MacArthur, aged 44, MacArthur's wife Sarah, 40, Dempsey, 11, Charlie, 8, and Russell, 4. Morrison would injure the 3 other MacArthur children, but they survived. Morrison then attempted to rape 15-year-old Maggie after telling her how much he loved her, but she resisted his advances, leading him to try to shoot her, and then himself, with a defective revolver. In the end, Morrison went out to the barn and tried to kill himself with a shotgun, only to fail again. A friend would find him lying in a pool of blood, and when the friend asked him why he had done it, the mass murderer replied, "I thought I would take them all with me." Morrison would recover from his self-inflicted injuries only to plead guilty at trial and hang. Was Morrison insane? His comments on the gallows suggest a man clearly disturbed. Quote, "I would like to say something for the good of the world. Life at best is short, and I hope that what I have done will be a warning to others to live that short life in a different way from what I have done. Life, I say, is short, and the sword is always hanging over us, and we do not know how soon it will drop." End of quote. As for Morrison, it dropped very soon. His hangman was the famous Radcliffe. The primary source for today's video was the chapter "A Good and Faithful Servant" in Sour Milk and Other Saskatchewan Crime Stories by journalists Barb Pacholik and Jana G. Pruden. Morrison's refusal of a stimulant before hanging is alluded to in The Practice of Execution in Canada by Ken Leighton Brown. Links to contemporary news articles, the case received coverage in the United States, as well as links to Frank and Kenton's research on the jail and the condemned men, are included in the description. The footage you see is me walking in that section of Wascana Park near where Morrison is buried. I hope you will consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, If you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Sanford Hainer, hanged February the 17th, 1910. At 8:10 a.m. on Thursday, February the 17th, 1910, Sanford Hainer, 24, was hanged at the Northwest Territorial Jail and Lunatic Asylum in Regina for the murder of Alfred D. Fraser at Margot, Saskatchewan on Dominion Day, a.k.a. July the 1st, 1909. Hainer would be the last man hanged at the jail. 3 previous inmates, Antonio Luciano and John Morrison, who were hanged for murder, and Knight Gunn, who died of tuberculosis, were buried in unmarked graves on the grounds of the jail, which is now Wascana Park. Hainer took 13 minutes to die. The motive for the murder was an unpaid debt. Fraser was plowing his field when Hainer shot him, first in the shoulder, then fatally in the head, as he attempted to run away. In Fraser's cabin, RCMP Corporal Abich found a note from Hainer which read, "Mr. Fraser, if you don't repay that debt right away, I will put a bullet through your head." Abich and a local merchant named Barth attempted to arrest Hainer, but he brandished his rifle and said he would surrender the next morning, which he did. Hainer went on trial at Yorkton, Saskatchewan on December the 10th, the defense pleading insanity. Hainer's mother traveled from Crystal Beach, Ontario, now part of Fort Erie, and testified that her son had sent her strange letters which referred to occult subjects, as well as ventriloquism, but both judge and jury rejected the idea of insanity and convicted Hainer, with no recommendation of mercy, after a 2-day trial, and he was sentenced to death. On February 17th, he walked firmly to the gallows, where Holmes, the hangman, wore both a mask and a false mustache as a disguise. Hainer's final words were, "I forgive everybody." Prior to his execution, Hainer confessed. Hainer would have been buried in quicklime to mask the smell of decomposition, buried in quicklime in the jail yard, but due to a special order from the Deputy Attorney General, the remains were claimed by a Regina alderman, and Hainer was buried in the potter's field of the old Regina Cemetery instead. The primary source for today's video is the article on Hainer in Death by Rope, an anthology of Canadian executions, Volume 1, 1867 to 1923, by Geoffrey Pfeiffer and Ken Leighton Brown, while Hainer's burial in Potter's Field is mentioned in Leighton Brown's The Practice of Execution in Canada. Other sources, such as contemporary newspaper accounts and Frank Korvemaker and Kenton de Jong's research on the Northwest Territorial Jail and the men buried in Wascana Park, are linked in the description. The footage you see is me walking in that section of Wascana Park near where the old jail stood, as well as a panorama of the Potter's Field in the old Regina Cemetery. I hope you will consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers.